Okay, next, let's work on the platforms of the Orlop. When working on these platforms, we first need to prepare this drawing. This drawing is the number 18, and it's associated with frame number 37. After preparing this drawing, we need to cut the sections for the 4 deck pieces. You don't have to cut precisely along the contour, a rough cut into 4 pieces should suffice. Just cut them approximately as shown, and I'll show you once I've done the cutting. Alright, now the drawings for the 4 pieces of the Orlop platforms have been cut. Next, I'll demonstrate using these 2 decks separately. Before we start, let me explain how to locate the beams. For the beams, we can see in the FB area of sheet F, there are several sets of beams. There is 1 set, 2 sets, 3 sets, and 4 sets in total. The bottom set corresponds to the largest platform. The next 3 small ones correspond to this drawing. These 3 correspond to this drawing, and the last 4 correspond to this drawing. Simply match each set of beams to the corresponding platform according to this arrangement. Okay, now let's talk about this largest piece of the Orlop platform. This large Orlop platform consists of 5 beams, and they are grouped together. Here, I've already sanded off the carbon black on both sides. The carbon black on both sides has been sanded off, but I haven't sanded the top and bottom carbon black yet. If you prefer, you can sand them beforehand. However, make sure not to sand off the sanding lines on both sides, this is crucial. If you haven't done it before completing the assembly, you can sand it afterward. These beams correspond to the positions of the beams on the top drawing. Match each one accordingly. There's 2 methods of making. One method is to glue them onto the drawing for more precise positioning and easier handling. If you choose this method, ensure that the sanding lines are facing the visible side, which is the upper side. Otherwise, sanding could be challenging, and the lines might not be visible. Pay attention to this detail. If you plan to make slots on the beams, we can see there are ledges and carlings. I highly advise against cutting slots on the carlings as they are fragile with a thickness of only 1.5 mm. Although theoretically feasible, cutting them would make them very fragile. If you are confident, you can do it, but I don't recommend it. However, it's possible to cut into the long beams. It's relatively simpler, although still a bit challenging, but the results are good. If you want to make cuts, cut the slots in advance. If you want to glue it to the drawing and make cuts, make sure to prepare the slots beforehand, align the positions, and then glue it onto the drawing. It's difficult to perform such operations directly on the drawing. Here, I have a deck that's already made. You can see the effect of the slots. This was manually cut. Later on, I'll show you how to cut these slots. Now, for making cuts, it applies to the beams of the Orlop platforms, the lower deck, the gun deck, as well as the forecastle and the quarter deck. There are several ways to do it. One way is to first find the corresponding position on the drawing, and then mark it with your knife. For example, for this beam, you can see it has a slot at the back. Flip it over, align the position with the one on the drawing. Mark the slot location here, and then we can leave the drawing. Now, there's a shallow mark on the upper side. I'll adjust the focus. You see, there's a mark there. Then, based on this mark, you can proceed to trim it off. There are many ways to make these cuts, so choose the method that suits you best. You can use carving knives or other tools, just make sure you can create the slot. Alright, now these 5 beams are sanded and ready. Following our order, we can arrange them. Some beams have slots on one side only, like this one. This applies to the beams on the 2 ends. The ones in the middle have slots on both sides. Make sure the slots are on the correct sides and ensure their positions align. You can compare adjacent beams to see if their slots align correctly. For example, like this, you can see that the slot positions match, ensuring that when you insert the carlings, then there won't be any issues. After completing this step, we need to prepare all the lodging knees. The lodging knees are on both sides, they are on the F-sheet with the beams as well. I have already sanded them here, and for the outer side, you don't necessarily need to sand it right away, sanding it later is also fine. However, the side that will be attached to the beams needs to be sanded, including this surface. If you want, you can follow the sanding lines and do a simple sanding now, or you can choose to sand them uniformly after attaching them. In the latter case, however, you need to ensure that the bonding strength is sufficient, but usually shouldn't be a problem. Nonetheless, the inner side here also needs to be sanded. I haven't sanded it very cleanly here, so I will sand it again later on. But generally, it looks like this. The inner side needs to be sanded. At the same time, I have also prepared all the carlings. The carlings are these ones. I have arranged them in the specified order. For the carlings, you need to use the 1.5 mm x 1.5 mm strips cut from the 1.5 mm thick sheet. Sand both sides of the carbon black, including the top and bottom. After this, if you have made slots on the beams, you need to extend these carlings slightly. Make them a bit longer than the actual length drawn, as you need to extend them into the slots. I'll take the topmost one as an example. For instance, you can see that both ends have a little extension. Of course, if you are unsure, you can leave a bit more, and later you can adjust it according to the actual installation. But in general, it should look like this. If you're not making slots on the beams, then cut them according to the drawing's length and glue them on. It's relatively straightforward. Now, we move on to the gluing process. Whether you glue from front to back or back to front, it's quite similar. You can operate according to your preference. I'm afraid some people may not be clear, so let me explain the process using this last beam as an example. Firstly, we need to attach the lodging knee on both sides to the next beam you want to work on. This makes the operation much more manageable. Attach it along the edge and sanding line to the same level, as shown. For the outer side, you don't need to do too much sanding, you can do the final overall sanding. So now the lodging knee is attached to the last beam. Next, we need to glue it to the part we just completed, attaching it to the top of the beam you made. Ensure it is aligned. The bonding strength at this point is crucial. Make sure the bonding strength at these 2 points is sufficient. If you're unsure, you can apply a bit of more liquid glue. A little overflow won't matter much since later you'll do overall sanding, and these edges will be sanded as well. The main thing is to ensure it sticks. The strength at this point is critical for later sanding. Next, we place 2 carlings. We may find that the carlings don't fit, and if they are too long, we need to trim them until they fit snugly. When placing these carlings, we need to consider 2 points. First, the length you trim should not be too exact. If the carlings can barely fit in, you need to trim a bit more. Because if you can just barely force it into position, it likely means your carling is slightly too long, and it might deform the 2 beams. This can affect other parts of the construction, so it's ideal to have a smooth fit but not too loose. Second, when placing it, the beam itself is 2 mm high, and the carlings are 1.5 mm high, so it has a directional issue. Make sure to align the sanding line upwards when inserting carlings. If you insert it the other way around, you'll encounter problems later in construction. So, it needs to be placed like this. After that, put glue on the both ends and then attach it. Alright, I have now completed the overall assembly. After assembling, I did a simple sanding on the top surface. You can also see that both sides have been sanded according to the sanding lines. The sanding lines had a small issue in the longest beam in the old version, but it didn't affect much because the sanding lines for other parts are correct. You can simply follow the sanding lines for other parts, and the result will look like this. Next, we can proceed to assemble the ledges according to the drawings. The process for ledges is the same as for the carlings. Place the platform with the bottom facing up, put it on the table, cut the ledges to the appropriate length, and then insert them. The ledges are 1 mm, so you can use 1 mm thick strip from the 1 mm sheet. Sand off the carbon black, cut them to the right length, and then insert them. You need to sand a small bevel for the ledges on both sides, but there are no significant challenges. Now, our ledges have been installed. There are no major challenges with the ledges, but it's a bit tedious because you have to repeatedly cut these dimensions. During your construction process, you can use a bit of glue to fix the platform, making the ledges easier to handle. After completing the ledges, we attach them to the corresponding deck, sand a bevel on one side, and that's basically it. Okay, so next, we have this platform. There's nothing particularly special to mention about this platform. The main difference is that on both sides, instead of lodging knees, it has these ledges extending to the edges. When constructing this, you can follow a method like this. First, you can attach two 1 mm strips to the top. Then, you flip it over, align the ledges at the corresponding positions, and attach them. For these two strips, you don't need to use too much glue, just a little bit so that it's easier to dismantle later. When attaching the ledges to the strips, again, you don't need to glue them too tightly, just a small amount of glue is enough. Why use these strips? It's because when you sand a beveled surface, having a bit of stability will make the sanding process smoother. Otherwise, it can be challenging to sand these ledges along the both sides. Having these strips will significantly assist in sanding. Another method is to sand them beforehand and then install them. Because there are sanding lines on the drawings, you can pre-sand the ledges and then attach them. Of course, in this case, the lined look may not be perfectly uniform, but it's acceptable. This is just one feasible solution, and the process for the other parts is the same as the previous deck. Now, with these 4 bottom deck plates completed, we can move on to the next section.